So there's a couple more things I want to say that's related to the subject of riffs. The first is finding a songwriting style. After you write a couple of riffs, you might start to notice yourself falling into certain habits. This can be a good or a bad thing. Obviously, you don't want to just write the same riffs over and over again, but what you can do is find a writing style that suits your sound and play to your strengths. These are traits that'll identify your music across songs, albums, and just keep all your ideas together. I suppose in a way this is still related to the idea of establishing foundations. Here you're finding a sound that you can build on top of. This is kind of an abstract concept, and it's basically meaningless without examples, so that's what the rest of this video is going to be. Again, it's mostly going to come from black metal, but in theory this stuff could apply to anything else. So as I've demonstrated before, a lot of black metal bands use the tremolo picking two-note riff sound, and it's part of black metal's signature style. But guys like Varg had his own style for Burzum, where he'd pick across the fretboard, which would give you this great sustain effect across the riffs. It's like an arpeggio, but he's alternate picking through the riffs. You can hear this in songs like Ea, Lord of the Depths. I want to take this moment to say something on the side about the series of videos I'm doing here. Now, Varg is surprisingly one of the few musicians out there who's released a lot of videos where he goes through his songs and demonstrates how to play them. And this is independent of something like a Guitar World feature or an interview that another guitarist might do. He's doing this on his own. His videos aren't very detailed, but he does briefly mention things like mood he's trying to create or just compositional information that you'd never know on your own, and I think that's kind of neat. Now I'm trying to aim a little bit higher, which is why I want to talk about songwriting techniques, but the purpose of this series is to basically give background information for when I actually do full breakdowns of my songs, which will come eventually. Originally I wanted to discuss songwriting in theory, but it's such a subjective thing that I found that I couldn't really make any general statements because everybody has their own personal approach. So what I want to do now is share my personal songwriting techniques and styles so other songwriters can get a different perspective, and hopefully this will catch on like playthrough videos, which are, they're okay. They show a lot of technical ability, or those like dumb lyric videos that record labels keep releasing. Hopefully instead we'll have more people out there talking about breaking down their own music, which I think would be really awesome. Now back on subject. Last video I talked about Alcest and pedal points as a part of Nij's riff style. You can extend this from picking patterns to chord progressions and just about anything else. For a classic example, a lot of early Metallica songs were based on the same chords as Diamond Head's Am I Evil. I showed this before with Master of Puppets. It's basically just a minor pentatonic plus tritone. So you get this from Jump in the Fire. Or Seek and Destroy. Metallica, they recognized what kind of sound they wanted to create, and they wrote a ton of different riffs using the same chord progressions, and they produced a lot of awesome music. A bad example of this is Iron Maiden, especially after Brave New World. They've abused the hell out of the minor 1-6-3-7 chord progression, which goes. They've written a lot of songs that uses not just the same chord progression, but the same strumming style. And these songs like Out of the Silent Planet from Brave New World. On A Matter of Life and Death we have, I think it's Brighter Than a Thousand Suns, definitely The Longest Day, and especially These Colors Don't Run, where that riff is basically 80% of the song. It's a little bit better on Final Frontier, but it does show up on the last track where the wild wind blows. A lot of times it's done well, but at the same time it doesn't really help that this riff is the classic 4-chord songs, which is a great video by Axis of Awesome. Essentially this is a minor variation of the major 1-5-6-4, which is Journey's Don't Stop Believing, or the Office theme song from the American version, and you just shift it over 2 chords to the 6, which puts us in the relative minor. The riffs, it's too common, and it's kind of lazy to see Iron Maiden overuse it so much. But as I've mentioned before, this concept can go beyond riffs. For example, lead guitar, Marty Friedman has a signature sound where he substitutes a note with a microtonal bend from 1 fret below, like in Tornado of Souls, For bass, everyone knows about Steve Harris's, 2-finger gallop. Not really much of a bass player. But about my own style, I consider the rhyming approach that I use in my lyrics to be a huge part of my sound. But this video is mainly about riffs, so I'll jump back to that. I think, we draw a lot of our songwriting techniques from our influences, which, makes sense. You play the music that you like to hear. I started writing music right around the time I got into black metal, and that was through Emperor and Anthems to the Vulcan at Dusk, and then later in the Nightside Eclipse, which is my favorite black metal album of all time. This discovery really opened a huge door for me, since I never really found a subgenre of metal that sucked me in the way black metal has now. Before, I used to be, I'm a huge fan of Maiden, still one of my top 3 bands, and I liked a lot of bands here and there, like Slayer or Death or Winter Sun, but I never really got into thrash, death, or mellow death. Black metal was a completely different story, and once I got hooked, I can listen to just about anything and, get really into it. One of the first bands I discovered after Emperor was a German band called Imperium Decadence, who I've mentioned before, and they've been a huge influence on my riffs. I'm still a 2-note riff guy, but I don't use tremolo picking very often. I prefer alternate picking or down picking 1/8 notes for my riffs, and I save the tremolo picking for leads. This whole thing comes from Imperium Decadence, and their album Prakela Vadens is a huge influence on me. For chord progressions, another thing I like to do is a lot of classical style, like dominant 1-5-1 endings. That harmonic minor resolution, like the theme to Metalocalypse, for example, where you're just going, I always liked harmonic minor and leads, but for riffs I was influenced by Angantyr, which is a Swedish/Danish black metal band with folk influences. The albums Haevn and Forvist are 2 of my favorites. I want to plug one more band, which is a local underground band called Salvaticus, whose debut, Hidden Mana, came out while I was finishing up the demo. It's a really great album, and I think it sounds like what a modern black metal album should sound like. The production's raw, but it's not outdated like the lo-fi 1992 sound you see some bands still trying to recreate. I prefer when people try to move forward and come up with their own styles. And for this album, the mix is really good, and it got me thinking about expanding the role of the bass, which ended up playing a huge influence on how I handle the production aspect of my music, which I also will talk about in addition to songwriting. So if you want to hear music that's similar to mine, I definitely recommend checking out these 3 bands. Anyway, these are just some of the techniques that I use here and there across my music. I'm still trying my best to be as creative as I can, and I never want to write the same songs over and over. But I do keep in mind what makes my music sound like me, and I find that really helps me when it comes to writing new songs.